For continuous air and water barriers on your next build, choose Zip System Ceiling Solutions. Seal tough jobs in a flash.
I'm Jake Bruton, and welcome to the UnBuild It podcast. Thank you for listening today. Today, I am joined by my co-host, Peter Yost.
Hi, Jake.
And Steve Basic.
Hello, Jake.
And today, we're going to start our conversation by saying, if you go back to the very beginning, March, April, somewhere in there, 2020, when the three of us started the podcast, and we started kicking around ideas of what we were going to talk about on the podcast, we did a whole series, a 4-part series on the control layers.
We started this just as the pandemic was cracking.
I believe so. Yeah.
Man, I didn't remember that.
I could have the date wrong. It could have been last year. I'm not sure.
Well, I remember we started remotely. We weren't together. We just did Zoom, right?
It's over a year.
Oh,
We're over a year.
It was 2020.
Yeah.
So let's just talk very briefly for those of you who have not gone back and listened to those podcasts and who weren't with us at the beginning. Control layer number 1, and we always, you'll get the chance to answer. Put your hand down, and we always talk about them in order of importance. At least we do. Most of our industry does. There's a reason. It makes it easier to really apply that hierarchy. What is number 1 and why?
And now we're allowed
Now
to raise
I'm calling
our
on
hand?
Steve. Sorry.
Oh, water.
Why?
Actually, the correct answer is water.
Bulk water?
Bulk water.
Bulk water is what you meant to say.
Yes, that is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, people. And why is it number 1 on our list?
Number 1 killer of buildings.
Because it is the thing that destroys our buildings the most. I agree.
I feel like I'm at a judicial review here.
Yeah.
I can neither confirm nor deny. Okay, and I am completely in agreement with you there.
Right. Although I didn't actively participate at that moment when it was defined, but that is what I believe to be true.
Peter, double or nothing, do you want to take what number 2 would be?
I'm terrified that I'm testifying as opposed to podcasting, but I believe that back in 2020, we decided that the second most important was the air control layer.
And why?
Yes, that would be correct, Peter.
Because it's the second way that we can move water. Not quite as much as we can with bulk, but whenever we're moving air, we're moving water. So it's the double penalty of the energy loss associated with that airflow, as well as the potential for condensation.
Okay.
And I'm not condescending. I'm talking about you know what I'm saying.
And so we can probably make an argument that it is like the single largest thing when it comes to efficiency of buildings.
The host has 3 more minutes.
Because if
I'd like
I have to cede my time. Okay. Because you could build a 2-foot thick wall, fill it full of incredible insulation, and then leave the window open, and now you have air leakage, and the temperature inside the room is going to be what the temperature is outside very quickly. So that's what air leakage is. It's leaving little tiny windows open or medium-sized windows open all over the
If the gentleman with the T.W. Perry shirt will refrain from talking when the host is talking, we'd appreciate it, please.
And so that's number 1 and number 2. There are 4. The other 2 are vapor and thermal.
That would be correct.
That would be correct. And so which one of those is supposed to come next?
Traditionally, we put vapor, even though it's not just about a control layer, it's the profile, but that would be the complete profile of the wall or the assembly as opposed to just the single layer. But we put that third ranked, and to the surprise of most people, before thermal.
Okay. And so whenever we talk about, I'm looking at you, Steve, whenever we talk about thermal being number 4, we almost kind of glaze over it and we just say, whatever's left in the budget, let's use up on,
yes, that is correct.
On insulation. So now we have water transported by air and energy transported by air, or heat transported by air, potentially we could say. Vapor, which is air form water on some level. Right?
I like that. I like that.
And then we have thermal resistance. So my question to you, when we start talking about water, and you and I both, Steve, have the same perspective on this, like why the hell are we talking about vapor so much? If we generate a really good bulk water control layer, and we generate a really good air control layer, and we do a really good job of proportionally scaling our insulation layer, and we have a competent mechanical system, which I think it's fair to say, if you're building a building correctly, we do. We have a competent HVAC system.
I believe that to be correct.
Why would vapor not be number 4? So my whole cross-examination here is, I think that I'm prepared to take the position that the 4 control layer order should be water, air, thermal, and then vapor, with the asterisk of, if you're building a house today, the mechanical system should be.
Are you suggesting that we put this to a vote?
Boy.
I'm not ready to vote yet.
I think that depends on who we're going to allow to vote.
I think we should really mess with the whole building industry and move vapor to number 5. Still only have 4 control layers, but move it to number 5 and just put not used in parentheses in the number 3 slot.
Placeholder.
Just the number 3 slot, like not used.
So it's a good way to screw with people. The high school that my wife used to teach at, they had senior pranks every year. And one year they convinced one of the teachers to let them into the building overnight, and they released goats number 1, 3, and 4 into the building. Like, they made a thing that Velcroed around the goat that had a number on it. And there was a goat with a number 1, a goat with a number 3, and a goat with a number 4.
So Charlie, the janitor, was like, where the hell's number 2?
They spent a day looking for goat number 2.
That is really clever.
It is genius. Whatever high schooler thought it up. Yeah. Wow. So tell me why I'm wrong. Or am I wrong?
Well, I think the problem here is that we really should not be giving the rank to vapor of 3 as a control layer. It's not about managing how buildings get wet by vapor. It's about making sure that there's drying potential built in. So this gets back to Steve's point, which is we're not worried about vapor pressure or how vapor moves for getting the building wet. That is a really low priority. We're worried about the building can get wet in 3 or 4 different ways. But if the water gets inside an assembly, there's only one way it can dry, and that's by a diffusion gradient that moves that moisture out. It's going to have to evaporate.
I would go out on a limb and say that the number 3 control layer is there to solve failures in number 1.
Or number 2.
Or number 2.
Oh, interesting.
So that's what I'm saying. We don't get water vapor unless you have air moving through the wall that's carrying moisture-laden air with it, or moisture-laden air, or we have a failure in our thermal layer. Like, let's talk about perfect wall for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So do we call that Stebrick's perfect wall? Do we call that Building Science Corp's perfect wall? I think that's kind of one and the same in our industry for the most part.
I would call them one and the same.
Okay. So walk us through what the perfect wall assembly is in there, in that, since you...
I defer to Peter.
He's testifying now.
You're not willing to elaborate.
This is not going to be used against you at some point.
I'm just having fun ducking down to the microphone.
The perfect building assembly is one in which you put the continuous insulation and air seal on the outside of the building and resist the temptation to fill cavities with insulation, because that leads to temperature change across the assembly, which is always a recipe for condensation. And the other thing about the perfect building assembly...
Is the air barrier on the outside or in the mid wall?
Yeah. I don't think it really matters where that air control layer is.
I always thought of the perfect wall as the extension of the persist system.
where all of the insulation is on the exterior of the building.
So that you have some type of cavity. Then you have the air barrier / could be the water barrier. Then more insulation, and then kind of you finish the wall cosmetically.
Yeah. The curious thing is that I think part of the name of perfect building assembly, or the most common would be the wall, is that you can build it in any climate and it performs optimally.
Perfect. And
it's the only configuration that you can take from climate to climate and you get excellent results.
You'd probably just end up decreasing the amount of insulation on both sides of the air barrier.
How much insulation, but the key thing is that it all be to the outside.
No locations
and it doesn't have to be a cavity. You know, in fact, I heard Joe argue or discuss with several building scientists, like if we could just build all walls out of masonry, you know, the structural part of the wall, you're forced to put all the insulation on the outside. So you have a higher capacity, doesn't care about water, to the interior, and you can't. It's not that you resist the temptation to insulate the cavity. You can't.
But didn't you just describe like most European wall systems?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
There's some kind of terracotta block or something that they lay up, and then they put 6 or 8 inches of EPS on the outside of that, and
the idea is if you warm your assembly so that it's conditioned similar to the people inside it, it'll last forever.
So in other words, my building frame is no different than the dining room table. It is completely inboard of the insulation. It is completely in the conditioned space.
Correct.
And therefore it cannot get cold enough to condense. So now vapor is not an issue with that wall.
And it doesn't matter which way the diffusion gradient is running. It's still, the assembly is not going to care whether the vapor pressure is coming from the outside of the building during the summer or from the inside of the building during the winter. It performs perfectly in all conditions, all climates. That's the cool thing.
I've kind of often viewed the perfect wall as what you might consider the protected wall. Like the air barrier and weather resistant barrier is embedded somewhere in the middle of the wall, so it has ultimate protection.
So Jake, I have to admit that when you started to get all wonky about the prioritization order, I thought, I'm going to really struggle with this. But here's a new thought about how to rank these systems. I think that we need a new category of control, which is occupants. So there's the water control layer, there's the air control layer, there's the vapor drying potential, there's the thermal control layer, and then there's the occupant control layer.
Which is me saying mechanicals as well. I mean, it's the same thing, right?
Well,
the mechanical is going to deal with the load that the occupant puts on the building, is my thought.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is sort of like along the lines of how Joe thinks about buildings. If we could just keep those people out of it, we could eliminate a whole problem and a load. And so it's cool that when we get done with the building science that relates to the enclosure, we still have to deal with the fact that despite our best efforts, if you don't educate the occupants about how important it is to manage moisture, a lot of your work is going to be defeated.
Real quick aside, the idea of we could just keep occupants out of the building, we would be able to manage all this much easier. One of the things that I always think is if I didn't have employees or clients, I would have the best job in the history of the world.
That's he needs a business control layer.
And I also overeducated my wife about where our optimal operating, temperature and humidity is for the home. This is the range for health for both us and the building. And when we first moved into our home, we were still getting a little bit high. We were floating around that 60 mark, high 50s, high 60 RH. And one of the things that I did was just raise the temperature 2 degrees in the house while she wasn't home. And then therefore the relative humidity
Lou Harriman would love this story. Lou Harriman is a building scientist who argues strenuously we should never be thinking in terms of relative humidity, always in terms of dew point. So
Nathan has a take on that too, doesn't he?
Oh,
Nathan doesn't use the word relative humidity, right?
And he thinks in dew points. we just had lunch with Lou Harriman the other day, just as a quick aside. And I said,
I didn't get an invite.
Lou, I have a really hard time thinking in terms of dew point. Why can't I think in grains of water per pound of dry air? And he got really excited. And he said, yes, it is the easiest way to think. But dew point is about what happens at the surface. That's why you have to think about dew point, Peter. Who cares about the grains of water per pound of dry air? What we need to do is sort of focus on what happens at the surface, which is fascinating to me. But
it's interesting that we asked the industry to think about concepts like a kickout flashing or proper flashing, and now you're suggesting that we think about humidity and grains of water per pound or whatever. I don't even know what the hell you just said, but whatever.
Grains of water.
Yeah, let's. We're going to strike that from the record.
You're doing a good job of carrying this witness protection program right to the end.
Today's odd pop quiz. Do you know how many grains of water there are in a pound of water?
72.6843.
Nope. It's roughly 7,000, right?
7,000.
It's right at 7,000.
Yeah.
Which means in a pint, there are 7,000 parts.
The committee would like to thank you for that useless information.
I wouldn't say it's useless. Peter, can you quote the how much moisture moves through drywall under regular sealed conditions versus the 1-inch hole over a season?
Well, this is a little thought experiment that Joe did. And he basically said, if you pick like a Chicago climate, you take the average temperature over a 3-month period, and you look at the relative humidity difference, you would get like, I think it's 1 pint of water through the wall during those 3 months, making it through that 4x8 sheet of drywall. And if you cut a 1-inch hole in it, you could move like 90 pints of water through that in the same time.
I remember it as an order of magnitude.
Yeah. So essentially, although that would be two orders of magnitude, 2 times 100 almost.
So in other words, air transported moisture is order of magnitude more damaging than vapor transported.
Yeah, we have everybody thinks that you can get buildings into trouble with just like diffusive air movement, and it's just not the case. It's air leakage that we really need to worry about, of course.
Okay, so I'm sitting with 2 guys that spent more than a decade each at BSC. Is that correct? Or you weren't quite there a year?
I was there for
10 years.
4.5 years.
Okay.
That would be about correct.
Okay. And so in that time, how many vapor damaged buildings did you investigate that had nothing to do with bulk water, that had nothing to do with starting in bulk water?
Well, an awful lot of the buildings were were bulk and or air leakage. But I think you're asking how many were diffusion related.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Not one for me.
At a company where what percentage of your work was building failure investigations?
Well, mine was not very high.
Sorry.
There was one, I don't know how you would label the cause, but what it was a development of houses for a certain group of people that I believe they were SIP paneled walls. And the issue was that because of the size of the house relative to the occupant load, which was relatively high, usually about somewhere around 5 or 6 people per like 1,200 square foot unit, that they were getting mold issues and condensation and stuff. And they did a lot of like ethnic cooking and stuff. So it was there was a lot of reasons that there were high levels of moisture in these small units, and they were having major mold problems.
So is that a mechanical failure?
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's not like quite a vapor problem, but it was a condensation issue, mold growth, water activity problem that was induced as the initial vapor form. So
the other
just trying
thing
to make sure that we support my argument. That's all.
I agree, because I would ask that question: how many houses have we ever seen that had a true vapor problem?
And it's interesting because in order for that to happen, for it to be just related to vapor, that building would have to have a perfect air barrier, right? And that's just not what happens. I mean, you can have something that was severely aggravated by the diffusive forces because the concentration of water inside the building was so high, but you're never going to get a building where that's the only problem. It's going to have bulk water leaks and or air leaks.
I think the committee is going to admit that vapor is not a sole problem to buildings.
Joe's big exception would be unless it's an indoor swimming pool and or an ice rink. You know, they have vapor pressure differences where it you know, can be a dominant force, but not in typical buildings.
I can't remember the story, but I remember him telling me it, and I can't remember the whole story, but Gus Handegord, that was like one of his major...
Hold on. Of all the names that come up, Lou Harriman, Joe, John Straub, you probably should stop and explain who Gus Handegord was.
So Gus Handegord is pretty much Joe's probably number one mentor. I mean, he spent a lot of time with John Timmisk only because he was, I think, the guy in charge of his PhD or whatever.
Right.
But Gus was probably like the one person that when Joe looked up the mountain, Gus was probably at the top of it. I think that's safe
and
to
what
say.
is the Henry that he wrote the book with?
Neil Hutchins.
Is it Neil
Yes,
Hutchins?
it's Handegord and Hutchins, wasn't it?
Yep, I believe so.
That's building science for
I was
cold
coming up
climate
with Henry
or north
Guilford
climate.
in my head.
No,
for some
Henry
reason.
Guilford is the plumber extraordinaire in New York City with what's her name, the architect,
Okay.
Christine Benedict.
Christine Benedict.
But that's Gifford.
Gifford.
Yeah, Henry Gifford.
And
he did write
the
a book.
title of that book?
It's
that I
building
own?
science for cold climates or northern climates. One of those.
It
is a real yawner.
50s or 60s.
I want to say it was a little later,
It
like
might
70
even be the
or
70s.
72.
The cover makes it look like it was
I
written
thought
in
it
the
was
70s.
older, but I think they wrote it for years and they finally published it in the early 70s. But I just remember sitting there and Gus saying something like, I remember, the building investigation that really kind of turned it around for me was when we investigated this ice rink and blah, 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 and we pulled down the insulation and it was sopping wet. And the conclusion was to insulate on top of the roof or something. But that I just remember, like I can picture him telling me that story, but I don't remember the facts. So yes, I'm not really prepared to give you any.
So you've gone from giving testimony under oath to incomplete recollections.
I'm willing to admit that this is hearsay.
That was him wandering in the dark at night without a flashlight.
So I think where we ended up on this.
I want to vote. I would like the committee to vote upon this.
Are we voting
I'm not
about
prepared to take a
adding?
vote. I'm not prepared to make a vote at this time.
Are we adding an occupant control layer? Is that the vote? Or are we reordering the existing ones?
I think for starters, the committee's priority here is just to reorder the control layers.
I'll concede to the man with the T.W. Perry jacket.
I think our problem lies in that we got sort of sucked into thinking of vapor as a control layer, and it's not the same.
I can tell you what I'm prepared to do.
You have to continuously think about...
sir, if you can please refrain and give me my time. Thank you. I think what I'm prepared to do is suggest that the most important are 1 and 2. The order of 3 and 4, really, I don't give a hoot.
Can I elaborate on that?
Yes, please elaborate. Thank you.
I think it's important to think of the priority of water first, air second, and thermal last of those 3. Where we're going to have trouble is, what do we do with this one that's not really a control layer? So I think what we should say is, yes, we need to have these 3 control layers, and they have to be in this order because they're all similar. They need to be continuous.
Okay,
you just like this is somewhat of a revelation, because when you said it's not really a control layer, I think the industry's problem with vapor being the big old bad monster is the minute I put up a detail or we do something, the first question is, where's the vapor barrier?
Yeah.
And so the vapor barrier suggests some level of ultimate control. And because we perceive it as a level of control, then it's being placed in the control layers. If we never really let vapor be part of the control layers, we wouldn't have this perception of fear.
Okay, so then are you putting forth a motion that the control layers should be water, air, and thermal, and there's just 3? Is that what you're saying? Because the vapor control layer then is a water control layer.
Okay, but, well, no, this committee's not prepared to do that.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. The reason is because there is some level of vapor control. If I suggested, and I will put you on the spot here, Mr. Chairman, as we did the Hilltop Aero House, one of the things that we did was to put Sega Myrex at the ceiling level to restrict the amount of moisture migrating into that vented roof system. So we did place a level of concern on how much vapor we control and allow into that assembly. So to totally write it out of the control layers, I don't think makes sense, because there are times where we're not creating a barrier, but we are restricting the flow in one of the directions while optimizing flow in the reverse direction when we use something like Intello or Myrex.
So now we've introduced the issue of climate differences, and that's, for me, that argues even more strongly that it's got to be just the 3 control layers, because you need those 3 control layers across all climates. The need for a dedicated interior vapor retarder is climate dependent.
Well, there is that. If you do control the thermal control layer, then vapor should never be a problem as long as it maintains the vapor format.
So my understanding correctly that the representative from New Hampshire and the representative from Massachusetts are agreeing on the topic?
I don't know if I can go that far. I'll have to consult with my constituents.
The representative from Massachusetts is finding it hard to understand whether you're asking me that if I agree with the committee or the gentleman from New Hampshire.
The gentleman from New Hampshire's position. What a ridiculous route this took. I would like to acknowledge to our listeners that we understand how stupid this got from that perspective, but the argument is still valid. That
I think we've made a lot of really good arguments and understanding in that the relevance of vapor, that while I don't think we can totally discard it, but I think we can heavily discount it.
I think part of the difficulty with thinking of vapor as a control layer is it's about drying potential, not wetting, and you can only address drying potential with looking at many layers or all the layers. We're not going to be able to manage vapor for drying potential in one layer. It's got to be about all the layers. And so that's where, for me, it breaks down vapor as a...
Yeah, because all of these are a vapor control layer.
Yes.
That's the problem here.
And
maybe that's the reason for the confusion.
And it doesn't matter what the climate is, you still should be speccing your wall system or any of your assemblies for drying potential. So that's the other thing that's neat to it about me is we worry about wetting in vapor form in very extreme climates.
Do you think it would make sense if we changed it from vapor control layer to a condensation control layer? But see, that's
no, because there's vapor and other...
Yeah, but thermal is more about controlling the amount of energy that moves across the wall in terms of energy efficiency. The condensation control layer would be a vapor control layer that is battling the number one concern, condensation.
Yeah, but that's not what the vapor profile is. Not about wetting. It's about drying potential.
Okay, note to self, let's not bring you along for future conversations.
That's not the first time I've been told that I should bug out on the conversation.
Well,
have either of you guys ever had acupuncture?
No.
I have had what's called dry needling, with
That's a sex
physical
thing. That's a totally different thing. He didn't know what you were talking about.
As soon as that entered my mind, I thought Jake's going to turn this.
Anyways,
Totally.
I don't like them. I find them to be a bunch of backstabbers.
Okay. And so with that, we are definitely wrapping up this topic.
So I think here's the important takeaway. Steve and Peter don't agree with me. I'm kidding. Of course, I know that's not that simple. I don't think we reached any sort of consensus, but I do think that I am going to start writing the control layers in a different order. And we'll see what happens, even if it just opens a conversation. I think it's important for us to continue to argue about silly stuff like this that may or may not matter in the grand scheme of things. But I can't wait to have a Heineken and an old fashioned with you two later and see where we wind up on this.
You're going to try to loosen our controls to have a conversation.
Don't say it like that after we made a sex joke. Or I made a sex joke, I guess, technically.
He's dry needling me again.
Just for the record, I'm going to refrain from any sexual activity with either of you.
I think
we both thank you for that.
Well, then that makes my joke not worth it.
This just went from a safe place to let me out of here.
My joke was going to be about making statements that I wasn't prepared to stand behind. On that note, thank you for listening today. If you're watching on YouTube, smash that subscribe button, smash that like button, as Steve likes to say. Shoot us an email. If you agree with me, if you disagree with me, if you think we're missing the point, if you think we're headed down the wrong argument, let us know. Tell us. That's why we have the email set up.
And we will hold Steve completely responsible.
So I think this committee is prepared to suggest that the questions email at questions at the UnBuild podcast is not only for questions, it's for discussion points.
It could be for comments as well.
Yes. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Goodbye.
Have a good day.